Hi, I'm Pete Atkins, and first I want to thank Joe for inviting me to be part of Midsummer Macabre and his ongoing series of author readings. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm going to read something from this book, which was the third volume in a trilogy edited by Stephen Jones. The name of the trilogy is The Lovecraft Squad, and this third volume is called Rising. I'm also in volume 1, and there's a whole bunch of really good people. So if you don't like what you're about to hear, don't let it put you off checking out the work of Stephen Baxter, Mike Chin, Adrian Cole, Brian Hodge, Lisa Morton, Tana Nevo, Reggie Oliver, John Llewellyn Probert, Angela Slatter, Michael Marshall Smith, Steve Rasnick-Tem, and Joe Fletcher. And Kim Newman is in the other 2 books as well, and doubtless a couple of other people, but I don't have them at hand. No offense intended. So what do you need to know about the actual story? It's called The Thing About Cats. Most of the titles in the books are sort of riffs or winks on existing H.P. Lovecraft titles. And the only other, there's 2 things you should know. Although it's very odd for a man my age to think of the 70s as a period piece, this story is in fact a period piece because it takes place in the late 1970s, which really means nothing except no streaming and no cell phones. There won't be any references to that, just like there aren't in Dickens or indeed Lovecraft. And the other thing, and this is more difficult, so you're going to have to suspend your disbelief, is that the first person narrator of this story is not a 65-year-old man. It is a 25-year-old woman. So you can turn the video off if you want, if that helps, or close your eyes, sit back, use your goddamn imagination, all right? Let's give it a go. The Thing About Cats. Turns out that by town car, the trip to the Upper West Side is going to take us nearly 40 minutes. Travis, our usual driver, isn't to blame. He's doing his best, but there's a Reagan rally in Midtown and it's screwing up traffic everywhere. About 20 minutes in, Mr. James chooses to point out that he told me we'd have been quicker taking the subway. And so I choose to point out that I married him for his money and that gold diggers are not, as a rule, expected to ride subways. Besides, I add, this Arthur Hillebrand character will still be dead whatever time we get to his penthouse. You say that, Mr. James says, and I have to admit he's got me there. If I had a nickel for every corpse I've had to re-kill for the department in the last 3.5 years, I'd have, well, I'd only have about 65 cents, but you get my point. Apparently, Mr. James and I could have taken the subway, Travis, I say through the open partition to the front seat. You could have had the afternoon off. Mix yourself a cocktail and watch Donahue or something. Would you have liked that? Travis finds my eyes in the rear view. What? He says, shaking his head. And miss seeing you in that dress, Mrs. J? I smile at him and turn to my husband. There, I say, because matters have clearly been settled. Why else, by the way? Why not the cops? Circumstances, Mr. James says, and associations. Ah, I say. So, Mr. Arthur Hillebrand is a person not unknown to the Bureau. I fish a cigarette out of my purse and waggle it for my husband's attention. Who is he, anyway? The zipper's in his hand already, bless him. Hillebrand, he says. He was a poet. Christ, I say, drawing in the flame and taking my first drag. No wonder somebody killed him. The private express elevator, into which the building's doorman had ushered us before tapping out an access code on one of those newfangled keypad thingies, takes me and Mr. James speedily up to the top floor, where it opens directly onto the reception area of the late Mr. Hillebrand's penthouse suite. I whistle. I assume the Vatican and Buckingham Palace have got this place beat, but I know a few embassies and country houses that are clearly going to need to up their game. I give my husband a look. I thought you said he was a poet, I say, because come on. Family money, Mr. James explains. nodding at the framed photographs of earlier and more respectable Hillebrands, bank owners, railroad barons, or whatever, and their stern and well-upholstered wives, before extending his hand to the stout fellow in Jeeves' drag, who's walking out of the living room to meet us. "I'm Mr. James," says Mr. James. "This is Tabitha. Was it you who called?" Jeeves shakes the proffered hand, though his slightly pained expression makes it clear that he's wondering whether Mr. James has any idea at all about the proper way to interact with household staff. Mr. James is perfectly familiar with the proper way to interact with household staff. He doesn't care for it. "My name is Kilgallen, sir," says the late gentleman's gentleman. "I did indeed place the initial call to the Bureau using a number with which Mr. Hillebrand had entrusted me, but I don't believe you and I spoke directly." "Look, you can certainly choose to remember that his name is Kilgallen, if that's what floats your boat, but I'm just going to keep calling him Jeeves. It's not going to bother him. I'm not going to say it out loud. And besides, at the moment, he's already busy being bothered by the fact that whoever answered his phone call hasn't shown up in person, which makes me wonder whether Jeeves has any idea at all about the proper way to interact with the FBI. "If you don't mind my asking, sir," he says, "what is it that you do at the Bureau?" "I investigate," Mr. James says, and gives Jeeves the benefit of his most charming, most confident smile. Somewhat placated, Jeeves grants him a nod before turning his still not sure about all this gaze on me. "And I do his dirty work," I say, without waiting for whatever insulting question it is that he's attempting to formulate. I'm really not sure that Jeeves and I are going to get along. My husband gestures to the living room. "Shall we?" he says. He waits till Jeeves has turned around before treating me to one of his best behave yourself looks as we follow the valet to the crime scene. There's a dead body, all right, and despite the aforementioned checkered history, which Mr. James and I have had with dead bodies, this one is convincingly dead, very cold and very still, and already starting to discolor. Oh, and missing its head. The curious thing about the body, apart from that, is that it seems to have greeted its demise with an impressive degree of aplomb. It's sitting upright, legs casually crossed, in a tall, straight-backed antique chair made from the kind of dark, heavy wood usually reserved exclusively for churches of the really miserable denominations. An ascot or cravat or something equally ridiculous is laid out on an occasional table beside the chair, and the corpse's white shirt is unbuttoned, revealing a hairless chest which boasts several carefully incised runic markings, though none of them appear to be recent. Both hands rest, seemingly at ease, in the body's lap. "His legs are crossed," I say to Mr. James, because I suppose that's what strikes me the most. I mean, who sits cross-legged and unperturbed through their own decapitation? "And in dress pants," Mr. James says. His voice is as respectful as he can make it, doing his best to spur Jeeves's feelings, I'm sure, but I still pick up the undertone of dry amusement at this confluence of elegance and atrocity. He turns his head to the valet and keeps his voice gentle. "And we're quite sure, Mr. Kilgallen, that this is Arthur Hillebrand," he says. On account of the no head thing, I offer helpfully. "Yeah, I know. Saucer of milk for Miss Tabitha. But I'm still pissed about that whole implicit and what do you do other than look pretty crap." "Mr. Hillebrand's fingerprints are, I believe, on file, should it be necessary to check, sir," Jeeves says, "but I'm quite certain." We follow his gaze as he looks pointedly down at the corpse's left hand. It's a moneyed hand, delicate and uncalloused, its fingernails manicured and subtly polished. And the fingers themselves are long and elegant, all 6 of them. "Huh," I say. "Would you look at that?" Mr. James, though, is already done looking at that. He's looking instead at the set of glass-paneled double doors off to the side of the living room's baronial fireplace. Striding over to them, he pushes them open to take a quick glance into the dining room. I sneak a peek too. As dining rooms go, it perhaps wouldn't look like much in the Waldorf Astoria, nor have turned heads on the first-class deck of the Titanic, but it seems perfectly up to the task of serving bacon and eggs to everybody who'd want some, should an emperor and his entire retinue happen to drop by. But Mr. James doesn't appear to be interested in counting the 24 place settings or admiring the 18th century silverware, the 14th century tapestries. He has that look of someone less interested in what they are seeing than in what they're not. He lets the doors swing shut. Bit of a squeak, to be honest. Jeeves perhaps not quite up to date with his WD-40 duties, and takes a step or two back into the living room. Sir? Jeeves asks, off his quizzical look and his silence. I'm very curious about the cats, Mr. James says. What cats? I say, before Jeeves can answer. There aren't any cats. Precisely what I'm curious about, my husband tells me, clearly weighing the possibilities of accompanying the comment with a smug smile. As I, however, am clearly weighing the possibilities of a drop kick to his solar plexus, he elects to restrain himself. Here's the thing, he says. To the majority of his neighbours in this building, Arthur Hillebrand was commonly known, and far from affectionately, as the Catman. Wait a minute, I say. Is this going to involve a rooftop-mounted signal from a police commissioner and a suspiciously fetishistic costume? No, he says, it's going to involve a suspiciously terrible racket, which by all accounts emanates from this penthouse every night at midnight. The concerted screeching, wailing, howling, and hissing of what sounds like 1,000 cats. Jesus, I say. And all the neighbours could come up with was a disapproving nickname? Why the hell didn't they try to get him thrown out? It'd be a tough eviction, Mr. James says. He owns the building. Owned, I say. A correction of tense, which I grant you is rather petty. But he keeps pulling out all these annoying facts, which he could have shared with me on the car ride over here instead of wasting his time cheerleading for the fucking subway. And it's getting on my nerves. Also, I add, at the risk of repeating myself, there aren't any cats. A small, discreet cough from Jeeves catches our attention, and we see that he's taken the opportunity to trot the mile or so over to one of the room's several floor-to-ceiling bookcases. The cats are in here, sir, he says, pressing the spine of a leather-bound book on one of the shelves. Well, it's a secret room, of course, and sure enough, it's packed to bursting with cats. No actual cats, you understand, unless you choose to count the few dozen mummified Egyptian ones scattered here and there throughout the collection, but instead what amounts to a museum's worth of feline representation through the ages. Paintings, sculptures, tapestries, photographs, children's toys, board games, revolting Victorian napkins with cute little kittens in baby clothes, VHS tapes of the Black Cat, That Darn Cat, The Aristocats, Island of Lost Souls, signed photographs of Anne Francis as Honey West brandishing her ocelot, and of all three of TV's Catwomen. That half rhyme of to Arthur from Eartha must have irritated his poet's ear, I'd have thought. High culture, low culture, ancient and modern, priceless masterpieces, tatty junk, a first edition of T.S. Eliot's Old Possum's Book of Practical Cats, a battered paperback of Enid Blyton's The Mystery of the Disappearing Cat. Clearly, if you were in possession of anything with a cat on it or in it and were looking to unload, Arthur Hillebrand and his bottomless checkbook had been your go-to guy. God, Mr. James says. Look at the eyes on that one. He's standing in front of a large portrait in oils of the ancient Egyptian cat goddess Bast. It's late 19th century and looks to be by one of the symbolists for sure, if not Jean Delville himself, then certainly school of. While Bast's human body is a pale and voluptuous fantasy-echoing dream of femininity, her fully feline head is sleek and black and striking, and Mr. James has got a point about the eyes. They stare directly out at the world, cruel, confident, amused. What do you think she's saying to us? He says. I have no doubt in my mind. You're all mice, I say. Brr, Mr. James says. and averts his gaze from her alarming splendor. Still, it's fairly clear that neither she nor any of her fellow works of art here are likely to be responsible for these reported midnight wailings. No fooling you, I say. I'm a detective, he says, with a modest nod. If I may, sir, says Jeeves, and we see that he's now brandishing an old 78 RPM record pulled from a cabinet behind him. I believe this to have been the source of the neighbour's irritation. There's a floor-standing antique Victrola in front of the cabinet, and Jeeves lifts the lid, cranks the handle, lays the disc on the turntable, and applies the needle. The noise is certainly horrendous. The collective screeching, wailing, howling, and hissing of what does indeed sound like 1,000 cats. But it's also astonishingly loud, wall-shakingly loud. No wonder the neighbours fucking hate you loud. Mr. James waves at Jeeves to stop it, and once the valet's lifted the needle arm from out the grooves and put it back in its housing, stabs a finger towards the large metal horn protruding from the Victrola. There's no way all that sound was coming from that, he says. No, indeed, sir, says Jeeves proudly. The master had it wired up to his recently installed quadraphonic sound system. Jesus Christ, I say, what was wrong with him? Mr. Arthur was an enthusiast of the unusual, Jeeves says, his sweeping gesture taking in the whole room. A connoisseur of the curious, goes without saying. Yet there you go saying it, I say. He cocks his head, mask of civility slipping just a little. I'm sorry. Apology accepted, I say. Tabitha, says my husband in that rein-it-in tone, which he always thinks is going to work. Before Jeeves and I can investigate our antipathy further, something else claims our attention. Off to the left of the Victrola is a freestanding plinth, atop of which is a life-size statuette of a Siamese cat. I really don't know what happens to make all three of us turn to look at it at the same time. Perhaps we sense a great disturbance in the force or something, but I do know that as soon as we do turn to look at it, the statuette steps elegantly from the plinth onto the lid of the Victrola and from there to the floor. Good Lord, Jeeves says, staring down at the cat. The cat stares back at him briefly and then, lest he should think it gives a shit, starts licking its front paw as if it may have picked up something unpleasant from Arthur Hillebrand's rug. Mr. James treats Jeeves to a raised eyebrow. Not an item from the collection with which you were previously familiar, Mr. Kilgallen, he says, and the valet shakes his head, long and slow. The cat, yellow eyes, long sharp teeth, tail flicking rhythmically, precise as a metronome, turns her face to me. Not Siamese at all, I see now. We hold each other's gaze for a moment, and then, slowly, she inclines her head, regal but respectful, like a formal nod of greeting. It's been a long time, the cat says. Good to see you again, moja sestra. Mr. James looks from the cat to me. Of course he does, who wouldn't in the circumstances, but I'm glad to say I married a professional. There's no trace of a double take, and it's no more than a second before he's turning to Jeeves with a smile that appears entirely uncompromised by the presence of a cat who's just spoken to his wife in Serbian. I understand you've had quite the day, Mr. Kilgallen, he says, but I wonder if I might trouble you for a glass of water. Now, while I have little doubt that Jeeves hears this as the obvious code for I need a word with my wife in private, that it is, I have to say he plays his part well. Of course, sir, he says, with just the right degree of unflappable. Anything for the lady? Tabitha? Mr. James asked me. How are you with Singapore slings? I asked Jeeves. Not entirely unfamiliar, madam, he says, though one hates to boast. I still doubt that Jeeves and I will end up as coffee date companions at any point in the near future, but it seems his jib has some cut after all, and it wins a small smile from me before he makes his way to the kitchen, which leaves me, my husband, and the cat. Well, I knew you had a mysterious past, says Mr. James, but we should talk about that at home. I say, already planning what to wear in order to turn his mind to finer things. Don't we have a murder to solve? Mr. James smiles, fishes in his pocket, brings out a quarter and rests it on the back of his thumb. Tell you what, he says. Tails, you introduce me to your sister. Heads, you don't. He flips the coin into the air, and I watch it as it rises. Then I watch it as it peaks. And then I watch it as it fails to fall. Watch it as it freezes in place, a good couple of feet above our heads. Mr. James, when I look back at him, is equally motionless, head tilted, eyes on the quarter, palm out ready to catch it, not moving, not blinking, not breathing. And I assume that somewhere in the kitchen, Jeeves too is currently not doing anything at all, and that my Singapore sling is paused part way between being and becoming. I'm not going to pretend that this state of affairs isn't disconcerting, because of course it is, but I'm already beginning to calm down. Coin and drink, valet and detective are perfectly fine, I realize. They are not frozen in time and space. Nothing alarming is happening to them. Nothing is happening to them at all. It's happening to me. I've not been folded through the continuum for several years, and it remains as disturbing an experience as I remember. I keep my eyes on the almost fixed point of the cat's flicking tail as I follow her between the worlds, through the emptinesses and the vastnesses, and the alternating coruscation of colors that last had names before the oceans drank Atlantis. It is every bit as impressive as you'd expect it to be, and I'm sure it would all look fabulously psychedelic in a Stanley Kubrick movie or a Jack Kirby comic book. But I have to tell you that in real life, one's enjoyment of it is significantly undercut by the nausea, 3 parts motion sickness and 7 parts metaphysical dread that invariably accompanies it. But as ever, it's just at that dreadful moment when you become convinced your psyche is about to be permanently shredded to nothingness by the dream winds that you blink, raise your head, and find that you're merely somewhere else, which is distinctly preferable to being in all the somewheres at once. Not that the somewhere I found myself this time isn't impressive. When I open my eyes, I'm standing in an antechamber of the throne room of the Dreamlands, and the cat, perched elegantly on a plinth of carved alabaster, is looking at me patiently, allowing me the necessary moment to anchor myself in this reality stream. Princess, I say, dipping my head, and she flicks her tail in response. It had been kind of the Lady Atalal to call me sister, but the truth is I'm barely of her species, let alone of the royal line. My mother, far from a full-blood herself, had further diluted the line 25 years ago by the romantic but ridiculous step of letting a 32-year-old self get pregnant by a 47-year-old private detective from San Francisco. There is, I gather, no actual rule about such matters in the Dreamlands, but Mum's earthbound dalliance is probably still a topic of discussion in certain quarters of the kingdom. Christ, I suddenly think, is that why I'm here? Your husband is hardly our concern, the princess says, as if I'd asked the question out loud. Right, the mind-reading thing, a trick that's missing from my quarter-breed's deck. Not that it's actually mind-reading they do, at least not the way we usually think of it. Atalal and her kind are creatures of dream. They don't read thoughts so much as they read emotions and the pictures that might accompany them, hence the princess's confusion. She received the impression that I was thinking of my husband, a detective in his 40s, while in fact I was thinking of my father, a detective in his 40s. Yeah, all right, Sigmund Freud, I know. Calm the hell down. Sometimes a pipe is just a pipe. Something is about to awaken, the princess says. Already its dreams disturb our realm, mutating the territories, breeding monsters from dream flesh, quenching the very stars in their courses. Great Kadath is already fallen, and over the scorched earth of Trefondain, the flayed skins of princelings flap in tatters. Still not big on small talk then, I say, risking a suggestion of a smile. And she rewards me with that slow narrowing of the eyes that her kind used to signify amused tolerance. At least I think that's what it signifies. Hard to be entirely sure, because it's pretty much the same expression they use when sucking the marrow from the bones of their slaughtered enemies. There's a war going on in the invisible world, my sister, she says, though I assure you that its consequences, should we fail, will be all too visible. Battles are waged on many fronts. In your world, for example, there are parties who work avidly to hasten the rising, seeking nothing so much as the eternal oblivion that they believe it promises. Your masters are already learning that there is another sleeper, one who lingers in the chambers of the dream sea, and all our auguries can as yet not tell in which direction his waking will tip the scales. With such a delicate balance, there is no room for tolerance of trouble-making dilettantes who merely seek power in their own right. The idiot in whose nest I found you, Arthur Hillebrand, I say, not so much interrupting as showing I'd been paying attention. Her contempt for him comes as no surprise to me. Her kind don't care for creatures who get magic wrong. And humans get magic wrong all the fucking time, especially the rich and stupid ones. It was me thinking he was driving his neighbors crazy just out of bloody-mindedness, I say. No, he was trying to summon you. His ridiculous and barely understood ritual did him little good, she says, though he did manage to gain access to the kingdoms on a few occasions. He thought he could gain power in the world of the spirits, but found instead, as all find who venture here unwisely and unwelcomed, merely the transmutation of the flesh. Ah, I say, in my best Mr. James manner, the sixth finger. Sixth finger, she says, amused. That's nothing. You should see what his insides are like. I'm guessing I'd rather not, I say. But you'd have to, surely, she says, like I'm missing a point. I suppose it depends on your choice of method. Choice of method, I ask. For killing him, she says, clearly glad to have had the confusion cleared up. As I say, current circumstances regrettably allow no tolerance for interfering opportunists. He won't be expecting you, per se, but nor will he be surprised that we sent someone. He's learned of our displeasure and has been trying to undo his rituals, burn his books. I'm missing something here. Are you sure there hasn't been a double booking at your end? I say, because judging by appearances, that mission's already been assigned. What? She says. Arthur Hillebrand's dead, I say. Severely dead. Atalal tips her head, like something's confusing her or taking her by surprise. You should be getting back, she says, and there's an unusual undertone of urgency in her voice. How much of this will I remember? I ask. I've never been great at remembering things from my dreams. Don't be silly, the Lady Atalal says. You're not dreaming. I'm dreaming. And for now, I'm done with my dream of you. I hardly have the time to take half a step forward and incline my head in goodbye before I'm completing that step in the secret collection room in Arthur Hillebrand's penthouse suite and looking up just in time to see the quarter flipped by Mr. James begin its descent. He catches it smoothly, claps it onto the back of his other hand, and reveals it with a flourish. Tails, he says, without looking. I win. A tiny hint of confusion clouds his eyes for a second, like he can't remember exactly what it was he'd been playing for, or why. Did I win? Well, I say, A, it's your double-tailed coin, so you know, duh. And B, as I've explained to you on more than one occasion, what more could you possibly be looking to win? You've already got me. Yes, he says, and his tone, to be honest, is a little cavalier for my money. A state of affairs I find more than acceptable, he adds, as I trust you know. But wasn't there something... Weren't we... He looks to the plinth beside Mr. Hillebrand's Victrola and at the rather nice but perfectly ordinary Siamese cat statuette that sits atop it. Mr. James is opposed on principle to the creasing of brows. It's indicating, he's been known to say, something a bad actor does. But I think a mild furrow might, at this point, be itching to make itself evident on his forehead as he grapples with the unfamiliar feeling of being unable to not quite remember something that might not quite have happened. Looking past the plinth and its lack of answers to whatever it is that's itching him, he looks to the wall beside the secret door and its row of small and not very good paintings of cats in anthropomorphic guises. Sailor cats, mailman cats, cowboy cats, baseball player cats, guitar-slinging cats in grey suits who are supposed to be maybe the Beatles in their Ed Sullivan days or something equally stupid. Just awful, the whole set. Dull as hell, as poorly rendered as they are imagined, and painted as they are on canvas rather than on black velvet, not even able to lay claim to the dubious virtue of high-end kitsch. And yet Mr. James is staring at them as if fascinated. Pictures, he says practically to himself. Pictures all in a row. There are better ones, I say, gesturing tentatively back at the imposing symbolist portrait of Bast and at the Boris and Bella movie poster, vaguely worried that my husband may have had a stroke while waiting for his coin to come down. No, he says, I'm in the other pictures. He waves me forward with him as he heads for the door and out through the living room to the reception area where we first met Jeeves. No Jeeves there right now. He must be a man who takes very seriously the preparation of Singapore slings, I'm thinking, as Mr. James stops in front of the family portrait gallery we'd glimpsed when we arrived. Take a look at them, Mr. James says. I take a look at him instead. This better not be a test, I say. Indulge me, he says. I'm testing an idea, not you. I look at the pictures. Parents, probably. Grandparents, presumably. Great-grandparents, possibly. All in matching frames, all in a row, all mounted on the reception area wall and set between a couple of those narrow doors that lead to linen closets or whatever. What do you see? Mr. James says. Several generations of sourpusses in extremely uncomfortable clothes, I say, fairly confident that he's not going to find much room for argument there. It's a good job you're lethal, he says, because you see, but you do not observe. Yeah, well, you play your fiddle and I'll play mine, I say. What's up with the pictures? It's not the pictures, it's the display, he says, sweeping his hand through the air along the row of frames to end between the last one and the closet door. I see it now. Though I am, I confess, somewhat underwhelmed. There's a significantly larger gap between frame and door at that end of the row than there is at the other. Clearly a household that needs to fire whoever's responsible for hanging its pictures, I say. Oh, wait, do you think it's Jeeves himself? Because those dining room doors squeak too, remember? It's probably a drinking problem. It usually is. He might well be drinking my sling right now. It isn't a picture hanging issue, Mr. James says. There was another picture here, obviously, and it's been removed, and I'm guessing fairly recently. Okay, I say, so a snap's gone missing. Isn't it a more pressing matter that so is Hillebrand's head? Mr. James gets that quietly pleased look he gets whenever he realizes what a clever boy he is. Actually, he says, I don't think that's the head we're looking for at all. The kitchen, which is at the far side of the dining room, and which is where Mr. James leads us now at a slow sprint, is unsurprisingly huge, though most of it is frankly little more than show-off space. In all that square footage, for example, there's only the one fridge. And in that fridge, there's only the one head. Ah, the late Mr. Hillebrand, I say. But Mr. James begs to differ. The late Mr. Kilgallen, he says. Jeeves, I say, because this sad, shocked, and ice-flecked face is not the one I've come to know and have mixed feelings about. The missing picture in the hall, Mr. James says, fair to assume, wouldn't you say, that it would be of the latest scion of the House of Hillebrand? Couldn't be left out there in plain sight, if said sign was about to pretend to be his own valet, and neither, unfortunately, could the valet. But that's not quite right, I say. I have it on the best authority that sixth finger thing proves the body is Hillebrand, a souvenir of all his occult dabbling, transmutation of the flesh, if you want to be technical about it. Says Mr. James. Then the situation is perhaps a little more complicated than it first appears. I think we'd best be on guard. He doesn't have to tell me twice. I'd already picked up on the creaking floorboard from behind the pantry door, and I'm spinning in its direction as it bursts open, and Jeeves races at us, a stunningly large cleaver raised in both hands above his head, and rage twisting his face. And by his face, I apparently mean, if my husband is to be believed, Arthur Hillebrand's face. Whichever iteration of himself he is, he appears to think he may have the drop on us. But I'm spectacularly good from a standing start, and I've been fired up for the sport ever since this guy first gave me attitude. Humans are so slow. I don't know what the hell this Hillebrand hybrid thinks he's dealing with, but he's about to learn. I'm sweeping beneath the clumsy swing of his cleaver and slamming a stiletto heel into his crotch before he even sees me hitch my dress to mid-thigh. A sight, let me tell you, that would put most would-be murderers into a frozen and vulnerable moment of erotic adoration, transmutated flesh or no transmutated flesh. He doubles over in the usual manner, allowing me the luxury of a glance across the work surfaces. A kitchen is full of useful tools for any conscientious assassin, and the bread knife's in my hand and busy opening 3 of his vital arteries before he fully straightens up. Disconcertingly, though, he does in fact straighten up. What he doesn't seem to be doing is in any way slowing down yet. Mr. James is leaning back against the Corinthian marble countertop of the kitchen's work island and lighting one of those gaulois verts, which he insists he smokes for the taste and not the demi-monde affectation. We can assume it was the real Kilgallen who made the call, he says, after Hillebrand appeared to have killed himself to avoid the consequences of his wizardly shenanigans. My husband has apparently decided he can best use this time in the tying up of loose ends, lest worrying about them should distract me from the fight. Hillebrand makes an impressive backhanded slice with the cleaver, which could really do some significant damage were I to choose to stay in place and let it connect. All things considered, my step to the side and downward sweep of the bread knife is the better call, doing enough damage to his hand to make him drop the cleaver. Mr. James takes a nice, slow drag of his smoke. But suicide wasn't really Arthur's thing, he says. Not when there was a perfectly good act of ritual magic waiting to save him. Poor Mr. Kilgallen didn't realize that he was about to become part of the ultimate master-servant relationship. Heads seem to have been the focal point of most of today's activities, so I decide my best plan is to remove the one that's currently busy snarling at me. I'm trying to find the right angle of attack to do precisely that when Hillebrand elects to do the job for me. Thumbs tight beneath his jaw below each of his ears, fingers tight at each of his temples. He gives something between an upward push and a sideways twist, and the head pops up and off like heads were always supposed to work that way. Most of the blood is gone in a single sickening cascade, but the severed trachea and the first few inches of spinal column dangle and twitch unpleasantly as one of the hands moves the head across to plant it squishily in the palm of the other. The head screams at me, which I'm going to hazard a guess, if the fury and hatred in the eyes is anything to go by, is probably die, bitch, die in Eldritch vernacular. Seems like big talk from a severed head resting on a hand, and I'm about to say so, until it raises itself 4 feet above Jeeves's palm, courtesy of the twitching limbs that are suddenly sprouting from the neck, branching out from the dangling spinal column like one of those step frame movies of plants blooming in speed dial. Within seconds, it's an ambulant fucking triffid, spider crawling its way off its former host and heading my way. Ah, Mr. James says, makes sense now. He points his cigarette at the monster, like a professor jabbing a stick towards a whiteboard. Bodies just flesh puppets, heads full of Dreamland's ectoplasm, hence the ability to make the initial swap. Hillebrand's jaw drops open, and the eyes roll up in the head, and though I don't quite see how the vocal cords still have a sound chamber with which to work, a horrific and deafening screech lets whatever neighbors may be listening know that the Catman's not yet done fucking with their sleep patterns. The mutating limbs and the mutating sublimbs blooming from within them by the second are multiplying wildly, spiraling out into the room like some crystalline spiderweb foaming into overdrive, fractal nightmare upon fractal nightmare. Chicken-like feet or claws are hatching from the ends of some of them now and skittering along the walls to help heave the head at the center of the web in my general direction. The mouth, still shrieking, is also masticating and drooling, like it can already taste the smorgasbord of viscera that used to be the hottest housewife on Fifth Avenue. It is fast, it is furious, and it is, in case I'm not painting a vivid enough picture for you, absolutely fucking terrifying. But I've still got some cat in me, despite the interbreeding. And the thing about cats is, once the game's on, we don't scare any more easily than we can be moved to pity. Whether you're cowering against the skirting board, wondering how the hell we got between you and your mouse hole, or swaggering at us with your fright mask and your Halloween screeching, it doesn't mean shit to us. We're coming in for the kill. I dive directly at Hillebrand's head as it skitters towards me on its nightmare legs, and I drive my knife in through the eye at an upward angle into the brain, like a cross between a transorbital lobotomy and a bullet to the head. I feel it die around the blade, feel all that rage and energy, all that sound and fury simply cease to be. The multiplying limbs, cascading fleshy horrors of a moment before, are suddenly motionless and pale, just abandoned spook show decorations, frighten us from a derelict ghost train. Within seconds, they're drying out like dead vegetation, desiccated and fragile, snapping like dead twigs beneath Mr. James's tread as he crosses the kitchen floor to me. He brushes a few of them off his jacket and pulls one or two from my hair before slipping his arms round my waist. Still no sound of that damn Singapore sling, I say, patting his cheek. Would you be a darling? I need to find the vanity. I think I may have broken a nail. He's barely located the gin before we both hear the buzzing in his jacket pocket. Mr. James takes a quick look at the text message on his pager and then shows it to me. I feel a small tingle of excitement. Though I have no idea what temporal anomaly Carnegie Hall may turn out to mean, I have a pleasant sense that the day has not yet ceased to prove interesting. Mr. James smiles. I'll have Travis bring the car round, he says. I take the drink to go.